I inherited a $5 million farmhouse from my late father. My greedy husband and mother-in-law stormed into the farmhouse and presented fake documents claiming ownership of the property. When I refused to accept the documents, they tied me to a tree with rope and burned my father's farmhouse. I was crying while they laughed and left me there alone. But after 2 hours, I gave them a horrific surprise they never expected. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how betrayal almost broke me but ultimately made me stronger. It all began the day my father passed away. He was my rock, my guide, and my source of unconditional love. Losing him left a gaping hole in my heart. But even in death, he left me a precious gift, the farmhouse. The farmhouse wasn't just any property. It was a $5 million estate nestled in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and trees that whispered secrets from generations past. My father used to say it was more than a home. It was a symbol of everything he'd worked hard for. He often reminded me, "This place is yours, Sarah. When I'm gone, make it your sanctuary." After his death, I decided to move into the farmhouse, hoping it would help me feel closer to him.
It did.
I spent my days walking through the fields, touching the walls of the home he built with his own hands, and reliving the memories of us sitting on the porch, talking about life. It was peaceful, until that evening when my life changed forever. I still remember the knock on the door. When I opened it, there stood my husband, Daniel, and his mother, Martha. They hadn't visited me at the farmhouse before, which immediately felt odd. Daniel, my husband of 5 years, had always been distant. He worked as a corporate manager in the city, constantly buried in his job. And Martha, well, she was a retired school teacher who never hid her disdain for me. She often reminded me that Daniel had married beneath himself. Over time, I learned to tune her out. But that evening, something was different. Their expressions were cold, their energy unsettling. "Sarah," Daniel said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." "What's going on?" I asked, watching Martha follow him with a smirk that made my stomach churn. Daniel pulled out a stack of papers and placed them on the kitchen table. "These are legal documents. Your father signed this property over to me and Mom before he died." I blinked, unable to process his words. "What are you talking about? That's not possible. My father would never." "He did," Martha interrupted, her voice sharp. "He wanted us to have this place. He knew you couldn't handle it alone." I felt my chest tighten as I picked up the papers. They looked official, with seals and signatures. But I knew my father better than anyone. He wouldn't have given away something so meaningful without telling me. "This is fake," I said firmly, pushing the papers back toward them. "I'm not signing anything. This property is mine." Daniel's jaw clenched, and his tone turned icy. "You don't know what you're talking about. These documents are legally binding." I stood my ground. "Then prove it in court. Until then, get out of my house." Martha's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "You ungrateful little," she began, but Daniel stopped her. "Fine," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you'll regret this." As they stormed out, slamming the door behind them, I felt a pang of fear creep into my chest. Something about the way Daniel looked at me, cold and calculating, made me uneasy. But I pushed it aside. I thought their threats were empty words. I was wrong. A few days later, I returned home from a walk in the woods to find Daniel and Martha waiting for me in the driveway. This time, their anger was palpable. "We gave you a chance, Sarah," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Now you're forcing us to take matters into our own hands." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Before I could react, Martha grabbed my arm while Daniel pulled out a rope. Panic surged through me as they dragged me toward the large oak tree near the edge of the property. I screamed, but there was no one around to hear me. "You brought this on yourself," Martha sneered as they tied me tightly to the tree. "What are you doing?" I cried, my voice trembling. "Let me go." Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he lit a match. My eyes widened in horror as I realized his intention. "No," I screamed, struggling against the ropes. "Stop, please." The farmhouse, my sanctuary, went up in flames. I could only watch as the fire consumed everything my father had built. The smell of smoke and the crackling of wood filled the air, but the pain in my chest was worse. This wasn't just a home, it was the last connection I had to my father. And they were destroying it. When the fire raged high enough to light up the night sky, Daniel and Martha walked away, leaving me tied to the tree. "Enjoy the show," Martha said with a cruel laugh before disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, I thought it was the end. But then something inside me shifted. Fear turned into resolve. Betrayal burned in my veins like fuel, igniting a fire of my own. I wasn't going to let them win. The moment Daniel and Martha disappeared into the darkness, leaving me bound to that tree, I knew I had two choices: surrender to despair or fight for my life. The flames from the burning farmhouse roared in front of me, licking the night sky. The smoke was thick, making it hard to breathe. The farmhouse wasn't just a building, it was everything my father had worked for. Watching it collapse was like losing him all over again. But I couldn't let it end like this. Not tied to a tree, defeated. My hands were bound tightly, the rope biting into my wrists. I twisted and pulled, ignoring the pain, determined to free myself. The firelight flickered across the property, casting eerie shadows. I focused on a jagged piece of bark sticking out of the tree. Gritting my teeth, I rubbed the rope against it, over and over, until my arms felt like lead. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, the rope began to fray. With one final pull, it snapped and I was free. My hands were raw and bleeding, but I didn't care. I stumbled forward, coughing and gasping for air. The fire was relentless, but I couldn't stop staring at it. My father's legacy was gone, reduced to ash by the people who were supposed to be my family. But as I stood there, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just heartbroken anymore. I was angry, furious. I clenched my fists, vowing that I wouldn't let Daniel and Martha get away with this. They thought they'd won, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. The first thing I did was call the police. It felt surreal describing what had happened. My husband and his mother tied me to a tree and burned my house down. I told the officer on the phone. The disbelief in his voice was palpable, but I didn't care. "Send someone," I insisted. "I can prove everything." While I waited for the authorities, I began surveying the damage. The farmhouse was completely destroyed, nothing but blackened rubble. The heat from the fire still radiated, and the smell of smoke clung to the air. But then I spotted something that gave me hope. Near the edge of the property, the security camera I'd installed months ago still stood. Its casing was melted, but the memory card inside looked intact. When the police arrived, I handed over the memory card. "This might have footage of them," I explained. The officers took it, promising to investigate. But I could tell they weren't convinced. Their skepticism was like a slap in the face, but I refused to let it deter me. After they left, I sat in my car trying to figure out my next move. My father had always told me, when life knocks you down, get back up stronger. His words echoed in my mind, giving me the strength I needed to keep going. If the police weren't going to take this seriously, I would build a case on my own. The first step was to prove that the documents Daniel and Martha used were fake. I went to a lawyer my father had trusted, Mr. Callahan. He was an older man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Sarah," he said after I explained everything, "this is serious. If those documents are fraudulent, we can prove it. But it'll take time." "I don't care how long it takes," I replied. "I need justice for my father." Mr. Callahan nodded. "Then let's get to work." Over the next few days, we dug into the documents Daniel had presented. It didn't take long to find glaring inconsistencies. The signatures didn't match my father's, and the dates were suspiciously close to his death. It was clear to me that Daniel and Martha had orchestrated this scheme, hoping I wouldn't fight back. But I wasn't stopping there. I started talking to neighbors and local workers who might have seen or heard something that night. To my relief, a few people remembered seeing Daniel and Martha's car parked near the property. One neighbor even mentioned hearing loud voices and a woman scream. Their testimonies added more weight to my case. Meanwhile, I retrieved the security footage from the memory card. Watching it made my stomach churn. There they were, Daniel and Martha, dragging me to the tree and setting the farmhouse on fire. Seeing their faces twisted with malice was like reliving the nightmare all over again. But instead of breaking me, it fueled my determination. Every step of the way, I felt my resolve hardening. Daniel and Martha had underestimated me. They thought I was weak, someone they could intimidate and silence. But they didn't realize that their betrayal had awakened a part of me I didn't know existed, a part that refused to back down. I began piecing everything together. The fake documents, the security footage, the witness testimonies. It was like assembling a puzzle, and with each new piece, I felt more confident. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about honoring my father's memory and making sure his legacy wasn't tarnished by greed and deceit. But even as I prepared for the battle ahead, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. What if the court didn't believe me? What if Daniel and Martha found a way to manipulate the system? I pushed those thoughts aside. You're stronger than this, I told myself. You've already survived the worst. Now it's time to fight back. The day after I compiled all my evidence, I received an unexpected call from Daniel. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but I could hear the venom beneath it. Sarah, he said, let's put this behind us. If you drop everything, we'll leave you alone. No harm done. I gripped the phone tightly, my anger bubbling to the surface. You set my house on fire, Daniel. You tried to destroy everything my father left me. Do you really think I'd let you walk away? He chuckled. Suit yourself. Just remember, you started this. I hung up, my hands shaking. His threat was clear, but it didn't scare me. If anything, it solidified my resolve. I wasn't going to stop until Daniel and Martha paid for what they'd done. After Daniel's threatening phone call, I knew there was no turning back. The fear that once lingered in the pit of my stomach had transformed into determination. This was about more than the farmhouse. It was about standing up to the betrayal that had been thrust upon me and reclaiming the dignity my father had instilled in me. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I worked closely with Mr. Callahan, my lawyer, who became my unwavering ally in the fight. Together, we refined the evidence I had gathered, ensuring every piece was as solid as a brick wall. The fake documents were the centerpiece of the case, and Mr. Callahan had them analyzed by a forensic document examiner. The results confirmed what I already knew. The signatures were forged, and the dates were manipulated. This alone could convict them of fraud, Mr. Callahan told me one afternoon as we sat in his cluttered office. But with everything else you've gathered, Sarah, they don't stand a chance. I nodded, clutching my cup of coffee tightly. They need to pay for what they did, not just for me, but for my father. He gave me a reassuring look. We'll make sure of that. The security footage was another crucial piece of evidence. Watching it was excruciating, but I knew it was necessary. It captured everything. The way Daniel and Martha tied me to the tree, the fire they started, and the cold, calculated expressions on their faces. Seeing it reminded me of the terror I felt that night, but it also reignited my anger. I handed the footage over to the police, who began their investigation in earnest. As the case gained traction, I started to feel a glimmer of hope. Witnesses from the neighborhood came forward to corroborate my story, strengthening the narrative that Daniel and Martha had orchestrated this vile act. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, recalled seeing smoke and the silhouette of two people leaving the property. Another neighbor remembered hearing voices arguing earlier in the evening. Their testimonies were the threads that tied the whole story together. But even as I built my case, I faced moments of doubt. Daniel and Martha were cunning, and I couldn't shake the fear that they might find a way to manipulate the system. My nights were restless, haunted by visions of the fire and the betrayal that had turned my life upside down. Every morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, reminding myself that this wasn't just for me, it was for my father's memory. The court date finally arrived. Standing in the courtroom, I felt a mix of emotions, anxiety, anger, and a fierce determination to see this through. Daniel and Martha sat on the other side of the room, their faces impassive. Daniel looked calm, almost smug, while Martha occasionally whispered to him. Their confidence only fueled my resolve. The prosecutor began laying out the evidence piece by piece. The forged documents were presented first, and the forensic expert testified to their authenticity, or lack thereof. His detailed explanation left no room for doubt. The signatures weren't my father's, and the dates were fabricated to give the illusion of legitimacy. Next came the security footage. As the video played on the screen, the courtroom fell silent. I couldn't bring myself to watch the screen, but I could feel the weight of the evidence pressing down on everyone in the room. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is irrefutable proof of the defendant's actions that night. Their intentions were clear, their methods cruel. Witnesses followed, one after another, each recounting what they saw or heard that night. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of the events leading up to the arson and left little room for Daniel and Martha to argue their innocence. As the trial progressed, I began to feel a shift in the air. The smugness on Daniel's face started to fade, replaced by a flicker of unease. Martha's whispers grew more frantic, her composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. But the turning point came during cross-examination. The prosecutor questioned Daniel about his presence at the farmhouse that night. His responses were evasive, his usual charm failing him. When pressed further, he stumbled over his words, contradicting his earlier statements. "Mr. Daniel," the prosecutor said sharply, "isn't it true that you and your mother went to the farmhouse with the intent to claim it as your own, despite knowing the property rightfully belonged to Sarah?" Daniel hesitated, his confidence wavering. I don't recall." The prosecutor pounced. "You don't recall tying your wife to a tree? You don't recall setting fire to the house? Or do you not recall because you've been caught?" Martha, sitting beside him, muttered something under her breath, but the damage was done. The jury's eyes were fixed on Daniel, their expressions unyielding. When it was finally my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped up to the stand. My hands trembled slightly, but I spoke with as much clarity as I could muster. I told the court about my father, the farmhouse, and the betrayal that had shattered my life. "They didn't just burn down a building," I said, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. "They destroyed the memories, the legacy my father worked so hard to create. But I refused to let their greed and cruelty define my story. This isn't just about property, it's about justice." As I finished, the room was silent. The jury looked at me with a mixture of empathy and respect, and I felt a small flicker of hope. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I believed I might win. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt an odd sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. I had done everything I could to present the truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The courtroom was tense as the closing arguments began. The prosecutor stood with confidence, addressing the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed and cruelty," he said. "It's about two individuals who betrayed someone they should have protected. Daniel and Martha didn't just forge documents and commit arson. They tried to destroy Sarah's spirit. But Sarah fought back, and the evidence proves that she is telling the truth. These defendants must be held accountable for their actions." The defense attorney's closing argument, on the other hand, was weak and desperate. He tried to discredit the security footage, calling it circumstantial, and claimed the witnesses were unreliable. But the jury's expressions told me they weren't buying it. The evidence was too damning, and the lies too obvious. After the closing arguments, the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. Those hours felt like an eternity. I sat in the courtroom, my hands clasped tightly, as Daniel and Martha whispered to each other. Martha's smugness was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. Daniel kept glancing at me, but I refused to meet his gaze. Finally, the jury returned. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of fraud, the foreperson began, "We find the defendants, Daniel Roberts and Martha Roberts, guilty." My heart raced as the foreperson continued. "On the charge of arson, we find the defendants guilty. And on the charge of attempted harm, we find the defendants guilty." The words washed over me like a wave, leaving me breathless.
Guilty.
They were guilty on every count. I felt tears well up in my eyes, but I held them back. This wasn't the time for tears. This was the moment I had fought so hard for. The judge sentenced Daniel and Martha to lengthy prison terms, ensuring they wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else for a very long time. As they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Daniel looked back at me. His face was a mixture of anger and defeat. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid of him anymore. Once they were gone, the weight on my chest began to lift. For the first time since that terrible night, I could breathe freely. The farmhouse might have been reduced to ashes, but my father's legacy wasn't gone. It lived on in my determination, in my fight for justice, and in the strength I had found within myself. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild, not just the farmhouse, but my life. With the insurance settlement and my inheritance intact, I began planning the restoration of the property. It wasn't just about rebuilding walls and roofs. It was about honoring my father and everything he stood for. The local community rallied around me, offering their support and encouragement. Neighbors who had testified during the trial became friends, and I realized that I wasn't alone. The farmhouse might have been isolated, but I wasn't. One day, as I stood on the property watching the workers lay the foundation for the new house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. My father's words echoed in my mind. When life knocks you down, get back up stronger. I had done just that. Looking back, I realized that Daniel and Martha's betrayal didn't destroy me. It transformed me. I found a strength I didn't know I had, and I learned that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about reclaiming what's yours and standing tall in the face of adversity. The farmhouse will never be the same, but it doesn't have to be. It will be a new home, a new chapter. And I will continue to honor my father's memory by living a life he would be proud of, one built on resilience, dignity, and truth. As I tell this story now, I hope it serves as a reminder to anyone facing betrayal and loss. You are stronger than you think. And even when everything seems lost, you can rise from the ashes.